Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's a Ukrainian talk show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and today we have a distinguished guest, Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Hi, Sasha. Glad to be here.
Great to have you as always. And Ivan Kucherenko from Kiev, Ukraine. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Sasha. Hi, Jonathan. Nice to be here.
Yeah. Okay. I know that you have a video for us today, Ivan. Can we start with that?
Yeah, during our last show, we discussed the price which Ukraine is paying for
Yeah.
this war, and I prepared this special video for you
Excellent.
to see.
Герой Андрій повернувся додому. Пам'ятаємо ціну волі, свободи, життя.
Залаєш ми в злу годину, залаєш ми.
Thank you very much, Evan. So very impressive indeed. Ukrainians paid dearly for resisting to Russia, and
They would pay an even bigger price if they do not.
Now Ukrainian soldiers are dying during this war, but if Ukraine will fail, if the Western help will stop, if we will not receive enough support, then the First World War, like the Second World War, soldiers of other European and American countries will die in war with Russia. So you just need to understand it, and despite the not in terms of money, of course, but in terms of life, which are priceless, Ukraine is paying much more price than any other country during this war.
It's not even so much a question how you evaluate the price that Ukraine paid. It's impossible to put some kind of a value, whether dollars or some other currency. It's not the case at all. The thing is that unfortunately the history is written by the winners. And if we will allow Russia to win this war, so all history of this war from beginning to the end will be written by Russians, how they were trying to liberate Ukrainian people, and there were Ukrainian fascists who decided to fight Russia in a just war, and but eventually Russia prevailed, and now, as you see, Ukraine is now free country, and all this bullshit, etc., etc. So I really do hope that that's not the case. That's not going to happen. And one way or another, whether it will take few months, few years, or maybe even 20, 30 years, the Ukraine will prevail because it's a free country and free people, and they will go through all necessary steps to ensure the victory for Ukraine and Ukrainian people. Jonathan, may I ask you, because as a great
I was
student,
waiting.
no, that's something interesting, because you see right now the West is very calculating in how much weapons to send, when to send, for how much. And were these calculations ever present in Second World War, in the case of Lend-Lease? And there are two, of course, distinguished steps. One is when before the Pearl Harbor, and another one after Pearl Harbor. So they're a little bit different situation.
No, that is very interesting because the United States had, in writing what was called the Victory Plan for by one particular general who was in charge of writing the Victory Plan for World War II, he had undertaken a study of previous wars and, in general, how much could the question that needed to be answered was how much could the United States mobilize in support of the war effort against the Axis without at the same time compromising its greatest ability, which is its industrial mobilization capability, its capacity to produce war materials, and which far exceeded the Axis potential. So they calculated that the United States, without harming its economy to maximally produce war material, could mobilize 10% of its manpower. So at
Which
the
is a
population
lot.
at that point, the United States had a population of 140 million. So this meant that the United States, in theory, had a manpower population pool of 14 million, from which it had to mobilize people for the Army, the Navy, the Army Air Corps, and the Marines, etc., for all those services. And in the event, the United States mobilized a little over 10 million and allocated them. They gave first call to the Navy because it needed, maximal sea control in both theaters. They gave second priority to the Army Air Corps, the Air Force, to give it because the chiefs of staff determined that we needed air superiority over the Axis in order to be able to safeguard any invasion of Europe, or for that matter of Japan. And so the lowest priority went to the Army, oddly enough, because the idea was to create a 90-division force, Army force, with what they could mobilize, but rely upon U.S. naval and air superiority to form a sledgehammer with which to beat the Axis over the head. Yeah, use it as a shield to make up the fact that the United States by itself could not guarantee numerical superiority over the Axis for the necessary ratios. So that had been figured out. And in terms of lend-lease, what to give Russia, what to give the Soviet Union, well, what the Soviet Union lacked was they lacked logistical capability. They lacked the ability to, they could certainly defeat the Axis defensively, but what they lacked was the ability to have sufficient logistical capabilities to support a sustained offensive against the Axis. Supplies, trucks, rather than horses and wagons, which is what the Axis had been relying on for the most part. And so in the calculation on the part of the United States war planners was we give the Russians the mobility, the logistics, the trucks, so that they could supply and sustain their offensives against the Axis. This calculation worked out well because even though, it wasn't the Red Army did not have perfect logistical capability on the scale that the United States had, it was still sufficient enough to enable the Soviet Army to sustain offensives progressively, counteroffensives against the Axis and wear them down. And it accounted for 4 million German army deaths on the Eastern Front. That's impressive. It's not an exaggeration to say that the fascist armies were bled white in Russia, and that the Russians have a legitimate claim to say that they paid the single greatest price for achieving victory over fascist Germany in World War II. So that's interesting. However, this does not give legitimacy to the subsequent claim by Soviet leaders and now by Putin that this somehow gives Russia a claim to dominance over Eastern Europe, or especially even all of the republics of the former Soviet Union. Ukraine has its own distinct history. And the Ukrainians resisted the Soviet armies that were coming back through Ukraine. They resisted them in a guerrilla movement until 1954. That says volumes about even after the Red Army had come back through, the Ukrainians continued resisting for years.
Just want to thank you, Jonathan. Just want to add, and this is important to understand because Russia obviously has stolen the victory in the Second World War on behalf of Soviet Union to Russia, but the majority of casualties during the Second World War was amongst Ukrainians, not Russians, actually, because
and actually
Ukrainians,
Georgians,
yeah,
the
yeah,
Jews.
they were the majority of the Soviet army, and when Marshal Zhukov said that don't consider any losses, women will born more soldiers. First of all, he was saying about Ukrainians because they didn't consider any losses during their defense against the Nazist army and during the counteroffensive attack. Millions of Ukrainians died in the Second World War, and then Russia said that it was we who won the Second World War, and we actually did it without Ukraine and without United States support, without allies, without anyone.
They might have been able to stop the Russians or achieve a stalemate against the fascist armies, as it was proven at Stalingrad, but the subsequent ability of the Red Army to maintain a sustained counteroffensive from deep within the Soviet Union and drive the fascist armies back and defeat them in detail and eventually march into Berlin. All of that was made possible. That offensive capability was, I would argue, made possible by the U.S. Lend-Lease, by the contribution of all those trucks and all of that mobility and logistical capability, which represented Russia's ability to mount a counteroffensive and drive Nazi Germany out of Soviet territory. But now you have this situation where the Russia no longer has that aid from the United States. They're on their own, and this time they're trying to achieve counteroffensive victory against Ukraine. And I would argue also that, in contradiction to what most Western military experts are saying now, and if you look at what the Western military experts are saying now, the vast majority are saying, they are saying that the war is at a stalemate. That's the conventional wisdom. Keep your mind on that conventional wisdom. This is what they're all agreeing. Oh, it's at a stalemate. We have to think about peace. We have to think about an armistice. They overlook the fact that between Russia and Ukraine, there can be no negotiated peace as long as the two political objectives are so irreconcilable. Russia wants Ukraine to cease to exist. Ukraine wants Russia to leave it alone. Just go away. And those are not reconcilable objectives. So what Ukraine is compelled to do, they are compelled to look for an opportunity to win their independence by inflicting a significant enough operational defeat upon Russian military forces, whether it's in the Black Sea or whether it's on land, but achieve a victory that is significant enough to force the Russians through strength to give up on that particular, at least in the short term, give up on their objective of trying to take over Ukraine. So, as I have argued in previous programs, the single most important objective is to sever the supply link and reinforcement link between Russia and Crimea. Once that is done, that single type of victory, once that is done, and if it is done in conjunction with defeat of the Russian Black Sea Fleet and force it out of range so that it no longer can dominate the Black Sea or even threaten to disrupt, those twin operational victories will compel Russia to accept, I would argue, compel them to accept an armistice and claim that it's a victory.
Very, very well put together, Jonathan. I think there's the biggest a tragedy, contradiction, if you will. What's happened is that at the end of Second World War, they were so-called a post-Dam peace, which meant, at least in my understanding, that all European war zone, was divided essentially into one west and one east. And there were some changes along the line. For example, Vienna and Austria were in a Soviet war zone, but then the West obviously was mindful of that tragedy committed, and they renegotiated that Austria and Vienna will be in the West zone. So since there were no, until 2022, there was no global European war, so to speak. So Russians believe that the Potsdam Agreement or peace or whatever it might call, it still exists today. And according to that, Ukraine, Belarus, republics, and all that stuff should be a Russian sphere of influence. And if United States and Europe, NATO, wouldn't meddle into these Eastern European affairs, Russia would simply rule because of the Potsdam Agreement. It would continue to rule all these countries as always it's done. And now, what do you think? There is wisdom of that, and that's why Russia is so adamant on fighting this war and continue its expansion and never agree to anything except a full Russian domination in this part of the world.
Well, Russia is attempting to do so under using a very narrow, yet in their minds, powerful lever of military power, their Russian nuclear arsenal. You know, the entire history of the Russian view of U.S. strategy, as I've written before, is that the principal means of leverage, they regard their nuclear arsenal, the growth, qualitative and quantitative growth of their nuclear arsenal, as being their main means of leverage over American policy. That was, in effect, what during the Cold War they regarded it as forcing the United States to change its strategy in accommodation to the growth of Soviet nuclear power. Now, in the post-Cold War period, they still regard nuclear weapons as a primary means of political influence. They see it as compelling the United States and the West to accede to Russian foreign policy goals, and it gives cover for Russia to use its own military power in support of those goals. So as long as the Russians are able to brandish their nuclear arsenal and threaten its use, and it's a lot of threats, then their aggression will continue. The logical asymmetric response that the United States and the West should adopt, not a direct response. We should not build more nuclear weapons. That is a symmetrical response, tit for tat. That is not useful. What you do, like a good chess player would do, you look for an asymmetric response, something which forces the other side to respond to what you are doing, rather than simply mirroring the other side. So in this case, because, for example, we have seen that the use of the Patriot ballistic missile defense system has been so very effective at the operational level, with a near 100% operational interception rate, that foreshadows the potential effectiveness of a global ballistic missile defense system, which, in order to achieve that against their nuclear missile force, all we need do really is upgrade the U.S. Space Force to where it has a space fleet armed with lasers capable of intercepting intercontinental ballistic missiles in their boost phase before they can leave the atmosphere and deploy decoys. Once you have that kind of force in Earth orbit, and once you are once the U.S. and NATO have that capability to neutralize the main means of Russian military power, their main means of leverage, once that is neutralized, Russia is effectively neutered. They are powerless. They cannot project power, and it would not matter if the Russians were to build a similar strategic defense on their own, although it would be inordinately expensive for them to do so. It would do them no good.
You'll never make it.
They would never make it. And matter of fact, the KGB admitted as much in their April 1985 report to Gorbachev that the SDI program, they believed it then, would eventually be able to block 90% of Soviet missiles in a first strike. And there was no way that the Soviet Union could keep up with this capability. That is what compelled Gorbachev to pull out all the stops in trying to persuade President Reagan to give up SDI, which Reagan very widely refused to do. he knew he had them.
Jonathan, I remember some people on this network in different programs, I forgot who and when, mentioned, yeah, I remember now. So someone mentioned why he loves Russia and its leaders. And he says, look at Gorbachev, what a great man. Look at how he shake hands with Ronald Reagan and then Bush. And he was so peaceful. He was so nice. But he forgets about that situation made him so nice because of the Ronald Reagan visionary approach.
Because President Reagan and President Bush had Gorbachev by the unmentionables. And Gorbachev knew it.
Yeah, he knew better than anybody else. But speaking about situation now, it seems to me that Russia, Ivan, do you remember a time when either right before the war with Ukraine or right after the beginning of the war, one Russian politician said, we recognize that in conventional weapons, West is much stronger than Russia. That's why we have, thank God, the nuclear weapons, which will unravel West and will destroy the London and Paris and all these cities.
And you're touching on that very point. The primacy, the supreme importance, the Russians place far more importance upon their nuclear arsenal than the United States does. I mean, the United States having a nuclear arsenal is just simply icing on the cake because we have more than one lever of political power and economic power to wield. And for the Russians, they have a very narrow base. And if that nuclear arsenal is neutralized, that is why the Russians fear more than anything else, even if they don't want to admit it in public. Their actions and their attitudes and their statements all point out this central fear. They fear the potential and the ability of American technology purposefully applied to neutralize the one thing that makes Russia a great power at all.
Yeah.
Or worthy of consideration. Neutralize that, and Russia becomes irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. Ivan, tell me, one of the biggest, if not the biggest advantage of Russia is its manpower. The country's population is 4 times bigger than Ukraine, so therefore they can bring more and more and more people on front. Now, I don't want to comment on the quality of these people, and some of them are being just trained for a couple of weeks, and some of them even don't have necessary ammunition to fight with. And also, if you take the front lines, there are so many people you can put in front lines. Okay, you can put 100,000, but I don't think you can put million people in the same space, or 10 million, or whatever it might be. So therefore, the military advantage of Russia and Ukraine, I don't think they have that much advantage. Okay, manpower, yes, but again, it's limited in scope and usefulness. And as the weapons, most of the weapons that Ukraine now has more advanced than Russians, and they're better in artillery wars, which Ukrainians lately winning. this exchanges. And so, Ivan, how do you think that what's ideologically right way of getting out of this deadlock? Let's say, okay, so now there is winter, so both sides will prepare. Although Russians don't stop, they're still going with the Avdiivka business, so losing more and more people there. But by the way, and I don't know what their goal is to. Maybe they
Perhaps
have.
they're thinking in terms of Verdun in World War One, where the objective of the Germans was to bleed the French white.
Mm.
And as it turned out, the Germans lost arguably as many people as the French, and it really the Germans were not able to mount another significant offensive on the Western Front until 1918. After, interestingly enough, after they defeated Russia and were able to switch their troops to the Western Front. So, yeah, if the Russians are thinking in terms of a Verdun style battle, which is going to bleed Ukraine white. I think that's a false analogy, and that they are going to they eventually, because the front is comparatively narrower in Ukraine and Russia, as if unlike if Ukraine had a much broader front to defend, then this idea of numerical superiority might make more sense. But as it is now, as the quality of Ukrainian weapons that they can deploy and other things which they can deploy in a counteroffensive against the Black Sea and against that supply line between Russia and Crimea. If they achieve victory there, the numerical superiority, I would argue, does not matter, because then the Ukrainians will be able to shift their forces once they've taken back Crimea and once they have defeated the Black Sea Fleet. Those two areas, then they can shift forces to the main front in the east and wear the Russians out. They will have and be able to bring enormous political pressure on Russia to abandon its goal and at least settle for an armistice. That is what they should be shooting for.
So in this case, Ivan, the preservation of human capital for Ukraine, its soldiers, is a very, very important thing indeed. So Ivan, what do you think may happen? Let's see, the winter will go through, then will come March, April. What do you think Ukrainian could do differently to become more successful in getting out Russia, at least from Crimea, and to cut their lines of communications in the south?
I agree with Jonathan, with you, and we just have to understand the motivations of Russians for going to this war. Russia already lost their professional army. They had very well prepared several hundred thousands of soldiers, and they've lost them during their unsuccessful attack on Kiev, on Sumy, when they were just destroyed, and then when they tried to capture Bakhmut. So now they're using, and after that they tried to carry out so-called limited mobilization, and the social opinion within Russia was pretty bad about that. So that's why Putin was afraid to announce a full-scale mobilization, and now they are working with only one motivation, to earn money on this war, because the majority of Russians, they live in poverty, and they consider going to war and killing Ukrainians a good way to earn some money. And even if they will die during this business, for them, their family will receive those money. So this is a promise which Russian government is giving to their recruits during their current mobilization. And first of all, which can stop it, is of course a better performance of Ukrainians towards Russians. If we will kill more Russians, then they will have to pay more money to the families of the killed Russians. And of course, with the major operational success, Ukrainian army will be able to kill even more Russians, and then probably Russian government will have some problems with paying those money to their families. But another part which is also important is sanctions against Russia in order for them to stop earning money, because now they still have the possibility to trade their oil, to trade their resources, to earn money, which will allow them to pay actually to their army for killing Ukrainians. Besides the sanctions, a great aspect is sanctions towards businesses which are still doing business in Russia and paying taxes here. Unfortunately, a lot of large international corporations, including the American ones like Unilever, like PepsiCo, they are still doing business in Russia. They are paying taxes in Russia, and because now the majority of Russian budget is going to war, they are in this way they're paying to those Russians who are going to war to kill the Ukrainians. So as soon as Russia will have both higher number of casualties on the battlefield, which is achievable using the modern Western weapons, not the supreme manpower, because Ukraine actually obviously is more limited in our manpower than the Russian. When they will have bigger casualties, when they will have limited opportunities to pay to new soldiers, actually to hire new soldiers, when they will have problems and delays with those payments to the salaries to those soldiers, delays in payments to the family of those who were killed, then probably it will make a significant impact towards Russian ability to carry out this war.
Actually,
So
here is
just
what Russia is doing. One very elegant thing is that obviously with the coming unrest in Russia, it's just a matter of time, but it will happen there soon. They need a lot of spaces in their jail against all the dissidents and against all the people who would be against the war and against Putin, against so on. They need a lot of spaces. So what they are doing, they're clearing all their jails and send these people to fight in Ukraine. And the thing is that when they're killed, there is no one to pay any compensation money. Like there are no families behind or so on. So they are clearing up their jails, and they have the human material which is being killed, and it doesn't cost them any money to carry it. By the way, I wanted to, before we finish our program today, I would like to emphasize what Mr. Zaluzhny said in his interview with or his essay with The Economist. He said one very interesting thing. When Russia losses exceeded 150,000 people, Zaluzhny's thinking was that for any country in the world, it would be enough strong argument to finish the war. If you're losing 150,000 people, 150,000. Remember, in 10 years of its war with Afghanistan, Soviet Union lost only, I think, 15,000 people in 10 years. And here's the lost, well, by some accounts, actually not 150,000, but it's more than 300,000 in less than 2 years. So that would be just by itself a very strong reason to stop war right away. Right, John?
They would have, and even if they were to stop it immediately, that scale of losses will have a significant demographic impact on future Russian population growth, economic recovery, if it is able to do so, or being able to reconstitute its military power for any future military operations that it contemplates. But in any case, that right now, with the situation as it is good thinking on our part, the three of us here, to look at a counter trend, to look at the exception to the general conventional wisdom, which says that the war is at a stalemate and that we should be, looking at possibilities for negotiated peace. Given what we have already discussed, that a negotiated peace that gives Russia any kind of reward for having started the war is no peace at all. It is a treaty of appeasement. And so what we must be careful to do is we must look for opportunities to, given the fact that there is no real compromise possible, we have to look for opportunities to compel Russia to accept the next best thing, a ceasefire, an armistice. And the shortest route for doing that is the infliction of a significant conventional defeat upon the Russians in the Ukrainian theater. The two best opportunities for that: severance of the Russia-Crimea link, logistically, as well as for reinforcement, as well as inflict a significant operational defeat on the Russian Black Sea Fleet, significant enough to cause them to withdraw out of range, effectively make them useless in the Black Sea.
It's already underway.
Yeah. And again, so it is within, so as you say, it is within reach. At least one of those objectives is within reach, quite possibly both. And quite possibly it is within reach and is attainable by the end of the winter, where we would, during which we would not necessarily have to mount a ground offensive during the winter, but all the Ukrainians really have to do is get within striking range of the attainment of those two objectives that I've mentioned. And we could see a much shorter end to this war than many in the West are predicting.
Excellent. Excellent. I agree with you, Jonathan. And hopefully this history will go in the right direction for Ukraine. And there will be even better cooperation with the West concerning the weapons, financial aid, strategy, and it has to be much more focused. And I'm glad that Zaluzhny is very objective in his analysis of what's happening so far. And I think he's a fantastic general, great professional, and with experience, he becoming just better and better. And I think that that will be a way with him to have further victories for Ukraine. And I'm looking forward to see you again on Friday, same place, same time. Thank you so much, everybody. Slava Ukraini.